Okay, well, after a few weeks break, we're coming back to Nehemiah. We're on Nehemiah chapter 2. I think Nehemiah is a lovely book because it reminds us of the task ahead and the rebuilding task that we need to do as Christians. And, even here in our church, I think this is something we need to be mindful. In many ways, we need to rebuild the walls, and because of the significance that makes. So just to recap, Nehemiah comes in a series of historical books after the fall of Jerusalem, where after Jeremiah and Isaiah and the people ignore the prophet's warnings, and Nebuchadnezzar comes in and scatters the Jewish nation. Many of them go into Babylon. But over the years, and God had always promised back, they start to return. And after about 70 years in exile, they start to wander back. And first of all, they start to rebuild their houses and get in the land. It's under a regional governor. It's no Israel Jewish king, and they start rebuilding. And after they've been back a decade or so, God sends the prophet Haggai to remind them it's time to rebuild the temple. They rebuilt their houses, they rebuilt their lands. They're sitting comfortably, yet they need to restore the place where God is honoured. And they get on and rebuild. And after that, they should have started rebuilding the walls as well. But they never did. And then it came to Nehemiah to be raised up by God to go back and to get the people to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, make it that holy place that God had always intended.
Once upon a time, after the children of Israel were freed from their exile and returned to Jerusalem, a humble Israelite cupbearer named Nehemiah asked his Jewish brothers, "How are the exiles in Jerusalem?" They responded with great sadness in their voices. "The people who actually survived are in great trouble. There is no wall in Jerusalem, and all her gates have been burned. The neighboring people come and steal and keep God's people in much fear and trembling." The humble cupbearer's heart broke, and he began to weep. He knew something should be done, but what? So he decided to pray and fast to ask God for wisdom. He cried out to the Lord and said, "Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of the king." Now Nehemiah continued to pray and fast, asking the Lord to bring this issue before the powerful Babylonian king Artaxerxes, and he waited until he was called to bring the king's cup.
Nehemiah chapter 1. So a couple of weeks ago we looked at Nehemiah chapter 1 and just remind us of the points that we drew from that first chapter. The first point was that in that sense that Nehemiah was cared enough about his people to inquire what was going on back in his homeland, back in Jerusalem. And he was able to do that and able to hear from friends because he held a position of importance in the king's court. He was a cupbearer, which was a very important job. And so that gave him information that he wouldn't normally have got from being an ordinary citizen around. He was at the heart of government. And so when he heard, he started to weep. The stories coming back from Jerusalem weren't good at all. The city he was expecting to be rebuilt by the number of people that had consistently gone back, and they've just ignored him rebuilding the city. They've got no desire to bring it back to its former glory. Now, sometimes when we weep, we learn that that's a sign of weakness, but in Christian circles often weakness is a sign of strength. And he prayed about this situation, about this news that he was hearing. And the thing we learn about that as a whole, Nehemiah was a man of prayer. He was one of those people we called an intercessor. There are many intercessors around, and they are people that God raises out, that have an extra special burden of prayer, not to pray for their immediate church or family, to pray in a wider circle. And that's what he did. But also, not only was he a great intercessor, he recognised that part of prayer means we need to confess the sins of not only ourselves, but of our nation and people and families as well. It was something that came out of that. And this is, so Nehemiah gives us a structure as we read through this book of how we should pray and what happens when we pray like him. And not only was he praying, but he was also prepared to volunteer. During this prayer time, God gave him a call to do something about these walls. And through that prayer, he was prepared to volunteer himself. And that's where we left him. He didn't try and pass the buck on to someone else. He simply said, "Here am I, send I." And that is a theme amongst a lot of God's people in the scriptures we learn. So, one of the overall lessons we learn from Nehemiah, he had the confidence to pray, to volunteer. Do we have the confidence like a Nehemiah? Because we do need people within our midst to have that confidence to pray and act as he did when God calls him to it. So we're on to chapter 2 here.
Previously, the humble Israelite cupbearer, Nehemiah, was lamenting the state of his city Jerusalem and her people, praying and fasting for wisdom from the Lord. He asked the Lord to give him favor before the powerful king Artaxerxes, and waited until he was called to bring the king's cup. Finally, one day he was called into the king's presence, and the king took one look at him and said, "Why is your face sad?" Then Nehemiah responded fearfully, "Let the king live forever. But I cannot be happy when the city of my forefathers is destroyed, and its gates burned down." The king looked concerned and then said, "What would you request?" Nehemiah was shocked, and he prayed in his heart, and he said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, king, then let me return to Judah, the land of my fathers, to rebuild the wall." So the powerful king let the humble cupbearer go to Judah and inspect the city to make plans to build. Not only this, but the king gave letters giving Nehemiah lumber from the king's royal forest to rebuild Jerusalem's gates. All of these things happened because the good hand of the Lord was on the humble cupbearer, and because the Lord loved his people and had promised to redeem them. So Nehemiah gathered all his things for his journey, packed his horse, and set out for Jerusalem, praising God for all his provision.
That's the story of Nehemiah. So we see at the beginning, it tells us in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, he took the wine, and the king noticed or saw something in him that caused the king to enter into a conversation with him. I think we need to remember that this just didn't happen. His relationship with the king had been built up over the years. We don't know how long he was a cupbearer, but we would imagine probably all his life he had been in the king's service. And that happens, doesn't it? When you can just imagine that with people who come into contact with government today, that over the years, if they become trusted, they will be given a position of trust that will hear and understand. They'll be able to talk to leaders more than ever than perhaps they had if they just hadn't really engaged with them and can't be trusted. So we know that Nehemiah was a very trusted person in front of the king. And that was essential because these kings had extreme powers. There was no courts in such in those days, and if you upset the king, he was just as likely to have you executed and not just sacked, but, you know, sacked completely, so to speak. So he learned to be patient. So he had this special position where he had access to the king, and the king trusted him. And he didn't push things, but he prayed to God that he would have a place to share his concerns with him, and believing that God would create a space for that to happen. But he had to be patient, didn't he? The early verses of this chapter tell him that he had to be patient. And sure, that's a lesson for us to learn. So not only was Nehemiah a person who wept and prayed, but he also waited for that right opportunity to speak to the king, which was crucial. In actual fact, he waited 4 months. That was quite a long time, wasn't it? He had this concern, waiting 4 months. But I'm sure it was the right timing that he went before the king. He didn't just receive this information and go blundering in, because it most likely would not have had the same effect. He prayed about it and waited for the opportunity. And that's the same. Just a little clip here. I do take my camera out quite a few times trying to catch the wildlife and all that, and I've been trying to catch this heron that comes on the Loddon, that when I walk the dog for quite some time now. He's often up there, and when I've sort of stopped, seen the heron, got my camera up, he's flown off. And this has been going on for ages. And this week, I think it was Wednesday, I was out walking along, and there was a heron, and I stopped, and he didn't fly off. And I thought, I haven't got my camera with me. So I took the iPhone out of my pocket, and I thought I'd have a go. So I stepped up to he's in the middle of the river, so I got up, I suppose, within about 10 metres of him, and started filming. And although he had a beady eye on me, he decided to hang around this time. Perhaps he and allowed me to do it, so I love that. But of course, what's he done? He's waiting and praying for the fish. And I don't know if you've ever seen a heron catch fish. They're quite remarkable. They sit, wait, they must have remarkable eyesight, and they go in. And I've seen it sometimes, but not often captured it on film. We need to be still and know that God is there, doesn't it? We need to know that. And it's just a reminder, as I was preparing this week, that we so much need to be patient in our prayers. And, you know, I can recall several instances where people have prayed for people for years, decades, before they see any answers to their prayers. And that's what we must do. It's got to be the right time for people to respond. God can't make anybody else do anything against their will. You know, especially with, you know, spouses that are not Christians. You know, we've got to keep on praying. Children that are not Christians, we've got to keep on praying until they are willing to respond themselves. God will never make anybody do anything to go away. He won't pressure people to turn to him. It's got to come from an openness and a willing of their heart, because otherwise our love of God wouldn't be true. It's got to be that way, and it's difficult to understand that sometimes, isn't it? It is really difficult to know and do that, to be patient. But we must keep on praying. Nehemiah had a result in 4 months. We may not have a result for a decade or two. But the thing we learn from Scripture is keep on praying. God is faithful to us. And in many ways, I believe that's one of the key lessons we learn from the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah had to be patient. And then he had to have the faith to unburden his heart. There he was in the king's presence. The king noticed, and the king gave an invitation to speak. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" And then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favour in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will the journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrived in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asa, keeper of the royal park, saying he would give me timber to make the beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall and the residence I would occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. And the king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat and Horonite and Tobiah, the Amorite officials, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So, as soon as he got the opportunity, Nehemiah unburdened himself to the king, unburdened his heart. He had the faith to ask, but he had the faith to unburden his heart and let the king know what needed to be done. Now it says there, as soon as the king gave that invitation, he prayed quickly. Well, often we can do that when we're in difficult situations, but I believe that that quick prayer that he offered there before he fully went into his speech was backed up by hours of praying beforehand. He was prepared for it. So, you know, yes, we can send arrow prayers or telegraph prayers, as they're sometimes called, instant prayers, but if they're backed up with hours of prayers beforehand, I believe they're more likely to be fulfilled, this. And so he unburdened his place, and of course he was widely received. And not only had he widely been that, but he was able to do that because through the death of Christ we can come straight into the presence of God himself. Nehemiah had to wait for an opportunity, but the book of Hebrews reminds us that as Jesus is our high priest, then we have access straight to the throne room. We don't have to wait. And that's the difference, isn't it? When we become Christians, our sin is dealt with, we're cleansed, we've got access to the very throne room of God. And because our sin has been dealt with, we are received with mercy and grace. There's no need, in that sense, to wait when that happens. We have got freedom to speak to God at all times because of what's happened in the past, and God has done it. So Nehemiah had that faith. But I think the other important thing that we need to remember, not only had Nehemiah prayed for this opportunity, but he planned how he was going to answer it, and had all the plans that he needed. It was no good him just going down to Jerusalem. He needed to go with a security detail. He needed with people to support him, and he needed access to materials to build the wall. You know, yes, the stones, a lot of the stones would be there, but there was no wood for the gates, so that's why he went and got permission to collect some wood from the king's forest, etc. Nehemiah just couldn't do that. He had to have letters of authority, and he had to have letters of authority to the governors there. And otherwise, he would run into trouble, because we heard in verse 10, when the officials heard about Nehemiah coming and him arriving, they were greatly upset and immediately were opposed to everything he was doing. So he'd have thought through his entire plan. And that's what sometimes we need to do. When we are praying, we need to think through God's entire plan for us, for what our prayers are. It's not just a question of praying. We need to think through these plans and to be prepared for them to come into fruition. Because there would be ramifications. He knew that once the walls were going up, that would cause difficulty in and amongst the surrounding communities. Whilst the walls of Jerusalem were down, there was, in that sense, people didn't fear the city. But walls were built in those days because it was a sign of power and authority. And of course, lots of other nations had footholds in Jerusalem because there was no central government to run the city. It's all being run from Babylon through governments. But of course, once the walls come up, that was part of Nehemiah's plan, that he wanted to re-establish the nation of Judah, the nation of Israel, once the walls needed to go up, the temple needed to be there, and the people needed to be united under a Jewish government, so to speak. That would make the change. Now, when he prayed with the king must have known that. And it was obviously a time where the king of Babylon was going to release Judah back out of his control. And although the king was happy about it, all those people the king employed to run that state were not going to be happy about it. So Nehemiah prepared himself for challenge and opposition. And we see that 3 Pacific people were named in this: Sanballat, Tobiah, and what was the other one? I lost the other one. It's there, Sanballat. Geshem, the Arab. So they were going to be the opposition, and we're going to hear a bit more about those in the coming weeks. So here we have these enemies They've heard him coming, and of course they wanted to. They wasn't happy that this was happening, and they was going to play an amazing part in trying to stop this happening. But of course the other thing that Nehemiah did was to inspect the walls for himself. Although he'd heard everything from his relatives and perhaps others that had come from Jerusalem of the wall, and he got plans, he needed to do it. And he needed to do that quickly. So when he arrived with his entourage at that, and they were settling in, at the dead of night, he went out on his own to survey the walls. And so he understood the full implications of the job he was going to do. This is planning, and this is the same for the church today. It's no good just thinking of things to do. We need to have some plans of how we're going to put them into operation. I think with Chocolate Sunday, in that there was, the plans came together slowly, didn't they? And as we came and prayed about it over the weeks, they gradually got firmed up with what we're going to actually do. And this is the truth in all things. We just can't jump in with 2 feet without some planning going on. So Nehemiah inspected the walls for himself, and that's good. As we read in verse 11, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there for 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went through the valley gate towards the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examined the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to go through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally I turned back and entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or the officials or any others who would be doing the work. So he inspected the walls, and we could say really that Nehemiah saw more at night than the residents of Jerusalem saw in the daylight, for he saw the potential as well as its problems. So here we are. Nehemiah has arrived in Jerusalem. He doesn't announce his plans straight away. He settles in. He goes out on his own or with his just close escort to inspect the walls, so he really knows. And then he comes back, and then he can really start planning how he's going to tackle this, and format his words that he's going to say to the community leaders there, and to understand the full opposition that he's going to come in. And this is still part of our job, the leadership of the church and people of the church. We need to raise up wise leaders like Nehemiah, don't we? We need leadership, and it's something I've always tried to do in ministries where I've been in ministry before, and I've been in ministries where leaders have always tried to plan ahead. Not always easy, but we need to prepare and raise up leaders. The church today needs wise leaders. We need leaders who are prepared to continually be challenged and taught the things that go on in this world and how to prepare for leadership. We just can't turn up each week and speak off the cuff. There's got to be some planning. There's got to be some thought that goes into it. But we need to pray. We need to be patient. We need to pray that God will give us an understanding of how to tackle these issues that we are facing in this day and age. We need to rebuild the walls of the Christian church in this country so it's strong and can stand up to the opposition that we see around us. Okay. So, Nehemiah, a man of God, a man of prayer and faith, a man who was patient, a man who gained wisdom because of his relationship to God. And the challenge to us is to walk in Nehemiah's footsteps, really. God, I believe, calls us all to be people of faith, people of prayer, to be patient. And not only through just ordinary prayers into